Hello, I'm Calm. Welcome to another video. This one carries on from my previous video, Complete Budget Builds 2019, where I explain basic PC parts, compare parts and suggest alternative components to increase the performance of these three modern budget builds. If you are thinking of building a PC, I encourage you to watch my previous video before you buy. Also watch it in full. There's some important information in there that maybe you haven't thought of, especially if you're new to this. I do try to simplify things. I have made mistakes, watched other YouTubers make mistakes. Hopefully by watching this video you won't. Here's a link for the first video, it's up to you. I wish I had all this information when I started, because I have watched loads of videos on the ultimate build. They go through all the parts lists and then have a long advert for their sponsors, and then Shazam at the end of the advert, it's all put together and they say, here it is, you've seen me build loads of these, so no need to show you now. This PC is great, buy all these parts and build it yourself. Great, eh? In this video I want to talk to you about how to put things together in a PC. It's going to be a long one. Yeah, I do go into detail, but that's me. If you haven't got time to watch it in one go, pause it, save it for later, go back to it when you have time. There's no problem in doing this, is there? I'm going to go through in what to look for and generally where things go. If you have bought the parts to make budget build B from a previous video, this will be beneficial to watch. This is the actual build I am putting together. Software installation will be in a future video. Subscribe and click the notification bell to get notified of follow-on videos. The first thing we need to do is prepare. We'll need a Phillips head screwdriver, a magnetic one to hold onto the screws better. A tray or container would be helpful to keep screws in. A snipper or wire cutter is good but not essential. We do, however, need to make the work area clear and free from carpet. Static is not our friend when handling electronic components. To reduce the static, which could damage components, make sure you're working in a carpet-free environment. Roll your sleeves up, tuck in any loose clothing or take it off. Wow, put that back on, dude. I meant change into something practical. Seriously though, we do not want to contaminate the motherboard with any fluff or materials from woolly jumpers, sleeves or loose clothing. Let's start with a case. Ours is the Cooler Master Masterbox Lite 3.1. This is designed for micro or mini ATX motherboards. A full-size ATX motherboard will not fit in here. First, we need to get into it. There are two panels to these traditionally shaped cases. The screws will either be on the front of the panel, like this viewing panel window, or the screws will be at the back, like this other solid panel. The panels will either detach straight off, like this viewing panel does, or slide off from front to back. When you've taken these panels off, put them to one side, somewhere safe out of the way. As mentioned in the previous video, the inside of this case has been powder coated, so there aren't any sharp edges. Be careful, this may be an issue in lower quality cases. Inside this case we have a box containing the extra parts, screws and sometimes freebies like these cable ties. What we're interested in first are the motherboard supports or standoffs and the socket used to screw these into the case. These standoffs hold the board in place inside the case. They also provide a space in between the case and the motherboard, so the back of the motherboard does not touch the case. That would be bad. We need to put these standoffs in the correct place inside the case to match the attachment holes in the motherboard. If we look at this picture, it shows us where these standoffs should be placed. Not all cases will cater for motherboard placement holes. Most of the holes will though. These must be universal standard ones. Using the socket, screw these standoffs into the case, being careful not to cross thread or over tighten them. Start with the top of the case looking at the motherboard diagram and work your way vertically, matching the amount of standoffs to the holes in the motherboard. Then move down to the next row. In some cases there might already be a central standoff or peg already mounted inside the case. Just count the number of holes that you need to the number of standoffs. Do your best, and if you're not sure, put them to one side. We're going to have a look at the motherboard soon to double check these. Best to be sure, as we don't want a single one of these in the wrong place. So open up the motherboard box and leave the motherboard in there. What we are looking for is a little metal plate which is called the I/O shield. This little metal plate fits inside the oblong hole inside of the back of the case. This is inserted from the inside. Looking at the motherboard, we can see that the circular sound ports are at the bottom. Therefore, make sure you put the circular holes of the I/O shield at the bottom. The little prongs that are sticking out from the non-circular holes should point inwards to the inside of the case. Be careful not to bend these. When you're sure you've got the I/O shield the right way round, press it into the hole by the corners only. These shields can be flimsy. Do not push them in from the middle, you will bend it. Some go in easy, some need a little force to pop them in. Pop in one end and try pressing alternative corners. I have seen some people use handles and screwdrivers to pop the stubborn ones in. Only do this as a last resort. Persevere for a bit first, you don't want to damage it. Tap and touch the case a few times to earth yourself. We're about to get the motherboard out and we don't want any static. The static bag will be taped down or tucked under, so open this up ready. Before we take the motherboard out, only touch the board from the sides or plastic mounts or the heat shields on the front. The back has a lot of soldered components and pins. These are like little needles and can be sharp and cut you and catch on your clothing, so be careful. When you've taken the motherboard out, place the static bag on the top of the motherboard box and then place the motherboard on top of the bag. Nothing to do with static, I just don't want bits of cardboard on the back of the board. Eye up where the placement holes are on the motherboard and then make sure you've got all the standoffs in the right place inside the case. Once you are sure, we'll now concentrate on getting the motherboard ready. We'll start with the RAM. If you have a single or twin stick kit, we need to know which ports are the best for these. On the motherboard diagram, it shows from left to right 4, 2, 3, 1. If you have one stick, put this in the port indicated as number 1. If you have two sticks, ports 1 and 2, and so on. Open the grip handles on the RAM ports that you're going to occupy. Now take out a stick of RAM. Avoid touching the contacts at the base, we don't want to get any oils from our fingers on there. When you look at the contacts, you will see a gap that's slightly off centre. This will match up to the RAM slot on the motherboard. It will only go in one way. You're going to hear this line a lot, keeping it simple. Line up the stick of RAM with the slot on the motherboard, making sure you've got it the right way around. Sit the RAM in the slot. Using your thumbs only now, gently add pressure to the ends. One side will click in and then the other. As they go in, the handles on either side will close. Repeat this for the rest of your sticks of RAM. All CPUs when working get hot. They need a way to cool down, so you will need a cooler. AMD supply great coolers with their CPUs. The Ryzen 5 2400G comes with a Wraith Stealth cooler. It works perfectly with this chip. The cooler will not attach to this motherboard though with these brackets on. These brackets are for a different type of cooler, a clip-on cooler. We need to take these brackets off. Remove the screws and take the plastic brackets off. Leave the connectors in the back though, we need to screw our new cooler into these. Before we do though, we need to install the CPU. It's the most expensive part of the build. To be honest, it's the easiest bit. No need to be worried, all you need to be is careful, delicate. The CPU socket has a handle at the bottom. It's held in place by a plastic retainer. Gently ease this handle sideways out from underneath the retainer and raise it vertically. Leave it in this position. Open up the CPU box and take out the cooler. Be careful not to touch the bottom of the cooler. There is thermal paste on the bottom. We don't want to contaminate or waste this. Put the cooler carefully to one side. Take out the container the chip is in and carefully open it so we can see the chip. Using your thumb and forefinger on the sides, carefully pick up the chip. Don't touch the top or the bottom, especially the bottom. This is where the pins are. Hold it firm but gently. With this grip you can swap it in between your hands easily, either holding it by the sides with one hand or at the top and the bottom with the other. It's tiny pins insert into holes inside the socket on the motherboard. To make sure you insert it the right way, the chip is marked with a triangle here on the bottom and here on the top. On the motherboard there is a triangle too. The triangles need to be matched up corner to corner. When you are confident you have it the right way and you have a comfortable grip, gently lower it into the socket. Do not push it in, do not put any pressure on it at all. When seated correctly, give it a gentle wiggle from side to side. It will only move slightly, not by much. If you are unsure, pick the chip back up with the same grip and retry. When you are happy it's in, lower the handle down and secure it under the plastic retainer. You will have to apply a little bit of pressure when doing this now. This action is making the socket grip the chip, which requires pressure. This is normal. Cooler installation. Check the motherboard to see where the CPU fan needs to be plugged into. Decide which way round the cooler needs to be by checking where the wire on the fan cooler is, to make it the shortest, easiest route to the CPU fan header on the motherboard. The mounts on this cooler are rectangular, not square. It will only fit in two ways. Pick up the cooler and decide which way is best. Gently lower the cooler towards the motherboard, matching the screws to the sockets. When you are confident they match up, apply pressure to the cooler on the sides like this, not on the central fan. The screws are spring loaded. You will have to apply a little downward pressure in order to make the screw make contact with the motherboard mounts. Start one screw off. Do not tighten it yet. We don't want to screw it in all the way, just a couple of turns. Do the same with the opposite corner. We are still just starting the screw off, remember, just a couple of turns. Do the same with the other two corners, and once they have all made contact, keep going round opposite corner to opposite corner, a couple of turns at a time until the screws are in nice and tight. Do not over tighten these. We do not want to damage the board. The fan wire connector on the cooler has a guiding groove on one side. Match this to the port on the motherboard. This guiding groove on the connector will slide into this lip on the motherboard port. It will only go in one way. I'm installing an M.2 solid state drive or SSD. It's not part of Budget Build B. I have one from a previous comparison video that I made. Here's a link for this if you want to check it out. It compares the M.2 format and the 2.5-inch Sata format. Same make of SSD, the Crucial MX500. If you are using an M.2, make sure the holding screw is in the right place before you start. There are different sizes to these M.2 drives. There is already a screw in this board, so I'll take it out, and then I'll slide the M.2 drive in at this angle. It will naturally stick out like this until I secure it with the mounting screw. Before we install the motherboard, let's familiarise ourselves with the board itself so we know roughly where things are and where things should be plugged into. Power to the CPU is normally at the top left hand side of the board. Main power is normally to the right hand side edge of the board. The audio port is at the bottom left. USB ports are normally at the bottom in the middle. The majority of the front panel connections are at the bottom right. SATA ports are on the right, going vertically up the board. If you have a smartphone with the camera on, take a picture of where the front panel connectors are at the bottom right side of the board. These markings are very tiny and will be even harder to see when the motherboard is inside the case. Make sure all the case cables are out of the way and the case is nice and flat. Now pick up the motherboard by the cooler, supporting it with the grip on the side. Tilt the board at this angle so it's not touching the back of the case, but you can guide it in at this angle so the ports at the back of the motherboard align and go into the holes inside of the I/O shield. Double check that the board is sitting correctly and all the ports are aligned through the I/O shield and all are accessible. Check the prongs are seated comfortably and are not bent. If it's not lined up correctly, retry until you get it right. Next, put the screws in one by one. Do not tighten them, just get them started. Push on the side of the motherboard against the I/O shield to line up the holes if necessary. Check all the standoffs you put in the case have screws in them, and now tighten them all up one by one. Do not over tighten them, they should just be nice and snug. I did struggle with one of the screws in the middle of the board at the top. I could not get my screwdriver in the case to tighten it. I overcame this by using a flexi screwdriver. You could probably use a small stubbier screwdriver if you haven't got one of these. Next, it's the power supply, the Corsair VS550. More power than we need right now, but room for upgrades in the future. The leads are already connected, it's not a modular one. Leave them bunched up like this until we need them. We are going to use the screws that came with the power supply to connect it to the case, not the ones that actually came with the case itself. The holes in the PSU are not all uniform, one is off centre. This is normal, all the PSUs are like this. The power supply mounts from the inside of the case. Before you start, decide which way you want the power supply. Do you want the fan facing downward or upward? Check your case to see if there's a vent at the bottom, otherwise you can only have it facing up. I'm facing mine downwards so it sucks cold air in and blows it out of the back. It will not compete with the fans inside the case as well this way. Start with one screw, don't tighten it unless you have all 4 screws in, then tighten them all nice and snug. If you have a different case and it doesn't have any feet on the bottom, I wouldn't face my power supply unit downwards. Before we start attaching wires, look where they need to be plugged into. Work out the best route through the case, which will firstly A, reach, and then B, look the tidiest. Look for parts of the case where the leads can be secured to with the cable ties. Let's start with the power leads to the motherboard. There's 2 leads, one for the CPU and the other one for the main power. The main power lead to the board has a large connector on it, so you can't mix it up with any of the others. It also has a lip on it, so you've guessed it, can only plug in one way. The main power lead plugs in on the right hand side of the motherboard. Careful, there are no standoffs here, so before you try and push this cable in, support the back of the board with your fingers. You don't want to snap the board, do you? The CPU lead is clearly marked CPU. This also has a lip on it, so can only be plugged in one way. As you can see, the lip has a flat part which will hug the connector on the board when installed. The CPU power lead plugs in on the top left. It's right next to a support, so push in firmly but don't overdo it. This is all the leads we need from the power supply unit right now. Tuck the other leads inside the empty drive cage out of the way for now and unravel the leads for the case. Look through the case wires and find the HD audio lead and look at it. There's a little triangle on this, but I'll come to that later. Look at the end of it, one of the connectors is filled in, it's not used. This lead plugs into the bottom left hand corner of the motherboard. This port on the motherboard has one pin missing. Match this up to the filled one on the connector. It only goes in one way. Make sure you have it the right way around before you try pushing it in. Next, find the USB lead. This is for the USB 2 port. Look at the connectors. One of the connector spaces is filled in. There are 2 USB slots on this motherboard that this plug can plug into. I'm choosing the one on the right. Same as the previous lead, it will only go in one way. Find the USB 3 lead. Look at the connector. It has an extra central lip on it. Look at the motherboard. This lead plugs into USB port 3. Just right at the last port that we used. The connector has a gap at the top where the extra lip slides into. You can only plug it in one way. All the other leads are bunched together. It's not like these are hard to do, they're just fiddly. Most of them have plus or minus on them. This is to denote positive and negative. These will match up to positive and negative marked on the board. These all connect to the bottom right hand side of the board. Remember, I asked you to take a picture. You will need this picture now unless you have great eyesight. The reset and power switch leads are not marked with plus or minus. If you turn them over, however, you will see they are marked with a triangle. This triangle is the positive side. These leads all plug into the 8 connectors on the left hand side of this port. Connect the bottom row first and then the top ones so you don't obstruct your view. Do not worry if the writing of the leads isn't facing the right way, this is common. Just concentrate on that you get them in the right connections. That's it for the case leads for this build. See, it's not that scary after all, is it?
You can do it!
There's only one spare fan header on this motherboard and the rear fan should be plugged into this. I'm going to put an extra fan in at the front, or my son is, so I'll go through adding this first. The screws for this fan come with the fan. If you are doing this too, check that the lead from the fan is in the best position before you attach it to the case. This is a 120mm fan and has a square format of mounting, so we can rotate it in any direction. Hold the fan on the inside of the case and screw into it from the front. Make sure the screws are in nice and tight, you don't want it vibrating out. There is room for 2 of these on the front if you wish, and possibly a thin radiator. In order to accommodate this extra fan, I need to use a splitter. Attach the splitter lead into the fan header port, same routine as the CPU fan header, it only plugs in one way. Then attach the two fan wires to the ends of the splitter leads. If you are plugging in the rear fan, it's no different. Plug it in, tidy the cable with a cable tie, as we don't want any of these leads going into the backs of the fans. At this point, I will connect the monitor, keyboard and mouse and power the system on to check everything is working at this stage before I plug anything else in. If it doesn't boot at this point, it will narrow down the possible problems. The first time a PC boots takes a while, so be patient. If the fans are turning, it's a good sign. If you're installing a CPU that hasn't got any integrated graphics, then you will have to install a graphics card and connect the monitor to the graphics card, not the port on the motherboard. The motherboard has no graphics capability without integrated graphics on the CPU. If you turn your PC on and it works, great. You can turn the power off now without any problems, but before you start adding the SSD, make sure you turn the power supply unit off, take out the power lead from the back of the power supply unit, and press the power button on the case a few times. Electricity will still be present on the board in the capacitors, etc. By pressing the power, you reduce this. If there's RGB on the motherboard, you will notice this light will be depleted when you press the power button a couple of times. Leave the PC to stand for another 5 minutes or so. Take a break for a while. Don't rush this. You could get an electric shock and ruin your motherboard by going back to it too early. When you install your SSD, you will need the two small screws for this. Mounting is on top of the drive cage. There are two hooks on one side and two brackets to screw into on the other. Don't over tighten these. There are no moving parts in an SSD, so it will not vibrate free. Also, they are light, so the two screws will be enough. Make sure you have the connectors pointing towards the motherboard. Look at these leads first before doing this. The SSD needs power and a data cable. The power comes from one of the leads from the power supply unit. There are two data cables that come with the motherboard. They are called Sata cables. Look at the connections on the SSD. The larger one on the left is where the power cable port connects to. The smaller one on the right is the Sata cable port. Both connections have an L-shaped connector, so again the leads can only be put in one way. Take the power supply leads out and route one of the power leads to connect to the SSD. One of the two Sata cables has a 90-degree angle on one end. Choose the Sata cable that is best for you. Usually the 90-degree angle one is best to fit on the SSD. Either way, connect one end to the SSD and the other one to the Sata port on the motherboard. I suggest the first Sata port, which is labelled 0. On some boards, if you install an M.2 drive, it will disable one of the Sata ports. So, if you have problems installing an SSD in future and you have an M.2 drive already installed, this could be the reason. We only have the Wi-Fi card to install now to complete this build, hardware side anyway. Take the Wi-Fi card out of the box and have a look at it. The Wi-Fi card has a long metal bracket which attaches to the rear of the case. It installs in the single PCIe port, so hold the card close to the case to figure out which of the brackets we need to remove from the case. We have to remove the third bracket down in this instance. Unscrew it carefully and lift it out. The Wi-Fi card comes with a USB cable which we need to attach to it and to the motherboard. The connectors are the same at both ends. There is a little lip on the connector to indicate which way round it goes. It can only go in one way. Connect one end to the Wi-Fi card before we install this into the case. The screw hole on the bracket goes to the top, so I'll put it this way round. Guide the connectors into the PCIe slot on the motherboard. It will just slot in, and now we can secure it by tightening the screw onto the case. Now attach the other end of the USB cable to the spare USB port on the motherboard. Guess what? It only goes in one way. This is at the bottom of the board in the middle. The Wi-Fi antenna is solid and well made and matches the case. It connects with two circular screw connectors via the Wi-Fi's backplate, which is now at the rear of the PC. It doesn't matter which way around they go, just screw them in. The base is magnetised and has a good grip, to be honest. That's how all the components install, As stated previously, I would test the PC and make sure it boots before attaching the SSD and installing the Wi-Fi card. Once you confirm that it posts, I would update the BIOS on the motherboard if needed, make sure the RAM is at the right speed, and make sure the board is set to UEFI mode before attaching the SSD and installing Windows. I will go all the way through this in the future video. I have put links in the description below for all the parts involved in this build, along with links to the 3 budget builds and the previous complete budget builds 2019 video. Check them out if you think of building your own or just want to check out the different builds. I hope you found this video helpful or interesting. Show your appreciation by hitting the like button, leave a comment below with any suggestions you may have. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for future videos. If you know someone new to computers, share this video with them or point them in my direction. I have a few learning videos that are very basic for people that are new to the scene. Thanks for watching. I'm Calm, signing off. Have a good morning, afternoon or good evening. Farewell till next time. See you later.